Almost everyone has opinions about banks. You may hate the lines you wait in, or curse the seemingly endless stream of fees, or cringe when you see the interest rate on your mortgage go up. But these are all personal issues. What about the broader role banks play in our communities? Banks are, after all, the arbiters of who gets money and who doesn't. What rules should they have to abide by in making those decisions? And how much say should the public have in that? I'm Sarah Bartlett, and this is our topic today on USA Inc. Joining us today is Diana Taylor, who oversees about $1.3 trillion in assets as New York State Superintendent of Banks. Diana, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm delighted to be here.
Why don't you first tell us what you do every day? What does a state banking superintendent do?
Oh, that's such a good question. Well, there are about 50 of us throughout the country. Each state has a state banking department. New York State is the biggest one. As you mentioned, we have about $1.3 trillion worth of assets under our purview, and that's just in the banks. We regulate, supervise, oversee 3,500 financial institutions throughout the state, which includes banks, commercial banks, thrifts, trusts, foreign banks, branches, rep offices. Also, we oversee the check cashers and money transmitters, budget planners, mortgage bankers and brokers, finance companies, premium finance companies. So it's a very diverse population. And the interesting thing is that we may be called the banking department, but only 10% of the institutions that we oversee are actually banks. And as regulators, what we do is we take the laws that are passed on the national and state levels, and we promulgate regulations based on those laws, make sure that our institutions understand what those laws and regulations mean, and then make sure that they are following them.
Now, how many thousands of people do you have helping you do this?
Actually, it's not thousands. We have a fairly small staff as agencies go. It's about, I think we have about 580 people, and our budget is about 80 million, give or take.
Now, there are federally chartered banks. They do not fall under your domain, is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. In this country, we have something called the dual banking system. So any bank that wants to do business in this country has a choice of either a state charter or a national charter. And the national charter would be either the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency or the Office of Thrift Supervision, the OCC or the OTS.
Does that present a problem for you in terms of sort of a crazy quilt system of regulation?
Well, that's a very good question, actually. And I have to tell you, when I started this job 2 years ago, you know, you look at state banking department, you think, well, you know, maybe fusty, musty, old, boring regulation. However, about 2 weeks after I started, the Comptroller of the Currency issued a notice of proposed rulemaking, which is what you do before you actually issue a new rule that people have to follow, saying that the way he was interpreting the National Banking Act was to say that any nationally chartered bank from thenceforward did not have to pay any, or their operating subsidiaries did not have to pay any attention at all to state lending or depository laws, which basically the result of that was to eviscerate any state consumer protection laws for nationally chartered banks. And when I started, we had some very large institutions under our purview as the state banking department. We had J.P. Morgan, HSBC, Bank of New York, you know, a lot of very large institutions. And by the way, we also have about 80% of the foreign banks that do business in this country under the New York State Charter. Anyway, so as time has changed as a result of some legislation that's been passed in the last 10 years, which opened up banks to be able to do business across the country, not just in the state in which they were originally chartered, but to do business in any state across the country, and to get into insurance and securities and all kinds of other areas that they weren't allowed to get into before. You have banks like JP Morgan and HSBC, which were doing business across state lines in the mortgage area, taking deposits and that sort of thing. So they looked at this new rule, which had been issued by the controller of the currency, and said, makes sense to us to have a national charter because then we don't have to pay attention to all 50 states. And in their defense, the controller of the currency was doing something that he thought was a good thing, making it easier for banks to do business across state lines, which I think is a very good thing to do. Banks are important. You want them to operate efficiently and effectively, and to the extent that it's very expensive for them to operate, those expenses are obviously going to be passed on to the consumers. And you want it to be easy to do banking around the country. I don't know how much traveling a lot of people do, but it's nice to go to a different state and have your bank there that you can go to, the ATM machine or whatever. And it's also a lot cheaper for them not to have to follow each of the states' different laws. And the other thing that had happened is a lot of states had issued new laws on things like predatory lending, for instance. That's really the one that comes to the fore. And some of those laws might have been a little bit onerous and gone a little bit too far in preventing people from not only making predatory loans, but also subprime loans. And some of the regulations were a little bit onerous. So the result was that the National Chartering Agency said, we're just going to get rid of them. Well, so the banks changed their charter. So two of our banks, HSBC and JP Morgan, changed their charter, taking 30% of our budget with them.
Wow.
So this was my first big
Welcome
challenge
to the new
as a
job.
state regulator. It's worked out. We obviously had to change how we assess the institutions who are under us. Until recently, until last year actually, when we changed the law, the only institutions out of the 3,500 that we actually charged were the banks, which are 10% of the institutions that we actually regulate. So now everybody has to pay. And we don't receive any tax money whatsoever from the state. Our budget is entirely from our regulated institutions, assessments on our regulated institutions. So it's been an interesting 2 years.
Yes. Well, having said all of that, when you look at the challenges that you face in this state in terms of the financial institutions, the whole range of them that you cover, what are some of the biggest problems that you see on the horizon, especially from a consumer standpoint?
Well, from a consumer standpoint, the biggest challenge that we have is one of balance. To the extent that the state legislature passes laws that make it expensive or onerous or illegal for banks to get into various markets that national banks are allowed to be in, it puts the state chartered banks at a disadvantage. And we're in the position of saying, well, we want to protect consumers too, but we have to balance that against what the national banks are able to do. And the national bank standard is a lot lower than the state bank standard in a lot of different ways. And if we don't even out that balance somehow, then more and more banks are going to go to a national charter, and we're not going to have anything to say about it at all, and neither is the state legislature. So one thing that we've been trying to do, and I've testified several times down in Washington on this, is even this out, because I think the answer is that we need national laws with a little bit more bite to them, and national regulations with a little more bite to them, so there isn't this race to the bottom. But this is a very hard thing to do. So we're in a position where, we try and do the right thing and make sure that consumers are protected to the extent that we think they need to be protected. But then, if all the banks change their charters, then where
you won't be regulating very many people.
We won't be regulating very many people at all. And
well, how serious a problem is predatory lending in New York City, for example?
It's a serious problem. But the problem, predatory lending means different things to different people.
Well, I was going to ask you, why don't you explain what you mean by that?
Under the law in New York State, a predatory loan is one that's over, I can't remember exactly how far over, whatever the relevant Treasury bill rate is. And there's no advantage to the borrower, and obviously if the disclosures weren't there and the borrower doesn't know what they're doing, there are add-ons and fees and things. And if the borrower is not able to repay the loan. So there's an income test to this. That's a predatory loan. The problem is that there's also something called subprime loans, and banks need to be able to reimburse themselves or pay themselves for risk. And there are some loans that are riskier than other loans. If you don't have a good credit history and that sort of thing, you're going to have to pay a higher rate than somebody who's had a credit history back, since the word go. They've got, 80% equity and 20% debt, that sort of thing. So, which gets into a lot of which I'm sure you'll get into, the HMDA data and that sort of thing that people have been very interested in. But there's got to be a balance between risk and return. But that being said, you need people to know exactly what it is that they're getting into, and you can't have people running around making loans that they know that the consumer is unable to repay.
Do you have a sense of how well educated the general consumer is? I mean, do you feel that people are, has there been anything surprising to you since you took the job in terms of an understanding of how banking works?
I think that there are a lot of people who do not know what they should be looking for, and I see that as a great big part of what the banking department and a regulator is there to do. I put in place a department whose job really is to help educate consumers and consumer groups. We put together a lot of pamphlets. We do a lot of speaking on predatory lending and ID theft and all of those other things. What to look for in a credit card. Ask questions. Call us if you have a question on anything. Don't just sign documents. Some of the horror stories are incredible about documents that people have signed, and it turns out that they basically signed away their home, something that they've lived in for 30 years. They ran into a bad patch. They had medical bills or lost a job or repairs that needed to be done. Somebody came to their door, said, sign here, we'll give you a chunk of money so that you can take care of this, and it turns out that they signed away the deed to their property. It's horrible. So a big part of what we need to do is make sure that people are educated and that the disclosures are such that people understand what they're getting into, which is a whole other issue, because I don't know if you've refinanced or financed a mortgage lately, but you've got disclosure documents like this. I didn't read them all. There's a lot of small print in there. So, disclosure is another thing. You can require people to write things down, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people understand what it is.
Well, you've got a big job on your hand. We'll be right back.
The Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College of the City University of New York is the largest and most diverse accredited business school in the United States, offering high-quality, full-time and part-time degree programs at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. For information about the Zicklin School of Business, please visit our website, zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu. That's zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Diana Taylor, New York State Superintendent of Banks. One of the roles that you have, I believe, is to encourage economic development. And that's sort of an interesting question of why is a banking regulator in the business of encouraging that, and what are the things that you're trying to do to stimulate the economy?
Thank you for asking that. It's not the typical role of a regulator to be sort of pursuing economic development or that sort of thing. This is something that happened fairly recently in our state's history, and I think that New York State is the only state that has a law like this in place. In 1998, Governor Pataki signed legislation which created banking development districts. And what that does is, under certain circumstances, which I'll get to in a minute, a new bank branch, qualifies for deposits from the state or local governments, municipal deposits, to go into that bank to help that branch get up and going and profitable. Because remember, what a bank does is it takes deposits and it makes loans into the community. And the reason that this legislation was passed was there are a lot of unbanked or underbanked districts, which means that there aren't any bank branches within, walking distance or whatever you want to.
In New York City,
where
would they be, for example? What
the
areas?
Bronx, the Williamsburg section of the Bronx, Bed-Stuy, the North Shore of Staten Island. We just opened one, parts of Harlem, Queens. There's some fairly large districts which do not have a lot of banks in them. And actually, one of the first things that happened when I came to the banking department was a woman, Sarah Ludwig, who's an attorney, a great consumer advocate, came into my office with a series of maps. She put down a map of the city of New York and the income areas, high income, low income areas. And on top of that, she put down incidences of predatory lending, complaints of predatory lending. And then on top of that, she put down where all the foreclosures had taken place. And on top of that, she put where the bank branches were. And guess what? The bank branches were not in the areas that were low income, high incidences of predatory lending and high incidences.
Well, that makes total sense.
Makes total sense, absolutely.
So why should a regulator encourage them to go into those areas?
Well, because we can. Because it's good for the economy, it's good for the banks.
But if it was good for the banks, why wouldn't they be doing it anyway?
Well, because it takes a while for a bank branch to become profitable, and the banks are going to put their branches where they think they're going to become profitable the most quickly, which is in the high-income areas where there is money. And if we can get them over the hurdle of taking a couple extra years to become profitable by something that doesn't really cost the state or the taxpayer very much money at all, which is putting money that needs to be put somewhere anyway into these branches so that the branches can use it and lend it out into the community for small business loans or mortgages or whatever it can be. It's a very low-cost way of putting a bank branch into a community. And we did a study, we did the first study on these programs. The results came in last spring. 11,000 new bank accounts, millions of dollars of new loans in those communities. It is a very, very successful program. So what we've done as the banking department over the last couple of years is actually go out and proactively identify with the city. We worked with the Department of City Planning and EDC and ESDC and the Department of Finance in pinpointing some of these areas where if somebody came into us with an application, we would probably approve it. So we did a lot of the work for them. And this has been incredibly successful. We've got districts in each of the 5 boroughs, which we are actively promoting. And there's a lot of interest.
It raises, to me, an interesting question about to what extent banks can and should be used for social policy reasons. And I see a number of shareholder activist campaigns saying, we want to discourage banks from making loans to companies where they're hurting global warming or where they're potentially getting involved in the Middle East in ways that disturb people. At what point is it a bank's right to just go along and make a little profit and pay its shareholders? And at what point is it fair to say to them?
It's absolutely the right. And as a regulator, our first priority is the safety and soundness of that banking institution. And in order to preserve that, we need to make sure that the bank, and income, revenue is one thing that we look at when we're doing an exam of these banks. We need to know what their capital base looks like. We need to know what their revenue stream looks like, in addition to some other things. And if a bank is not making money, it's going to go out of business, and that's not good for anybody. We need the banks to be profitable. And banks in and of themselves are not for social engineering, and I think it's wrong and as a regulator, I would never tell a bank where to put its money. I mean, we have all kinds of criteria as to the riskiness and creditworthiness of a portfolio, but we're not going to tell them where to put their money. We're not going to tell them who to open accounts for. They are business propositions, and they need to make these decisions themselves. And if they do something illegal, then they will be brought to task, obviously, but I don't think that they should be used as engines for social change other than incentive programs such as the Banking Development District.
Would a taxpayer money, the municipal funds that you mentioned that are going in there as deposits, as incentives, would they be earning any different rate of return if they were in it? Is that not money that the taxpayer is in effect subsidizing?
It's just the branch, though, and that branch
Right.
is making loans into the community. Small business loans, the local barber shop or restaurant or, mortgage or whatever. I don't think that that's what you're talking about as far as the social engineering and the South Africa type investments goes. But, on a local level, there's a whole body of law, the Community Reinvestment Act, which has been very successful in incenting banks to do the right thing for their communities. And that's a very interesting set of laws, actually. Which basically say to banks, we want you to invest in the following ways in the communities. And as a result of that, then we will give you ratings, CRA ratings, which are good to poor. And the only stick that we as regulators have if a bank does not live up to those, it does not have a high rating, is that we can say, okay, you can't do that merger and acquisition, or you can't open that branch. That's all we can do. We can't
Well, those
do
can be
anything
pretty
else.
severe sticks.
Well, yeah, I know. But,
This is a federally driven
Yeah.
act, the Community Reinvestment Act?
Yep.
And do you see any evidence that it's really had an effect in the New York
I think
area?
it's had a huge effect. And one of the things that it's shown, which is the same thing as the Banking Development District, is to the extent that the community does better and that you invest in the community, you know, the rising tide raises all ships, there's more money, banks make more money, there are more deposits, there are more places to loan, people do better, and they work with their banks more.
So it's a win-win for everyone.
Right, it's a win-win for everyone.
How much have you had to get involved with money laundering and sort of terrorist financing activities? How big an issue is that for you?
It's a huge issue. As you know, the Patriot Act was passed right after 9/11, and before that there was the Bank Secrecy Act and a couple of other acts, which require the banks know their customer. In other words, as a bank, you're supposed to know who your customer is and what they're doing. Banks and all financial institutions actually are required to file things called SARs, which are suspicious activity reports, and CTRs, which are currency transaction reports. You know, if a transaction is outside certain parameters, then they have to file these reports so that people can follow up and make sure that there's no untoward activity going on. It's a huge burden on a lot of banks, and there have been some banks and financial institutions which have been brought to task for not doing these things properly, and there have been some very large fines assessed on some institutions. And so everybody's paying a lot of attention to this. And it's sort of, people are erring on the side of filling out these reports as opposed to not, so the system's being a little bit inundated. But it's a very serious problem. And you know, how far do you go in requiring that a financial institution know what its customer is doing? And then how far do you go in a correspondent banking relationship? Do you, as, you know, pick a bank, need to know what the bank who has a correspondent relationship with you is doing and who that bank's customer is, and, you know, how far along does it go and what can you reasonably expect people to know? This is a very serious question, and I've talked to several banks who have said the compliance systems that they've had to put in place are hugely expensive, and the correspondent banking business is not that lucrative to begin with. The margins are very slim, so why are they in the business? So then you ask the question, okay, if these guys, these big guys get out of the business, then, you know, then where are you?
Then what? I mean, it's hard to tell when banks complain, oh, we're so overregulated, we're so overtaxed, you know, there's all these people telling us what to do, we just need to be left alone. It's hard to know how much to take that seriously.
There's a little whining that goes on. But I will tell you that a recent survey, the survey last year, it's the CSFI, and I can't remember exactly what that stands for, but it's the CSFI, which does surveys every year on financial institutions. The number one threat to banks that they see themselves, their number one risk was regulatory risk.
So you carry a big stick.
Yes. We do.
I can't help but observe that most of the bankers that I've ever met are usually men in gray flannel suits, and you're obviously not one of those. Has that been an issue for you at all?
No, it hasn't, and I'm happy to say that most of my direct reports at the banking department are also women.
All right, a few of us.
Yeah.
We've been fortunate to have Diana Taylor, New York State Superintendent of Banks, as our guest today. Thank you, Diana, for being on the show.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It was a pleasure.
We'll be right back.
Some people think of New York as the world's second home. The City University of New York, with students coming from 90 countries and speaking more than 155 languages, is the world's first university. Find us on the web at cuny.edu or call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES.
Should banks be tools of social policy? On the face of it, many of us would probably say no. Yet that is what is slowly happening as regulators, activists, and shareholders increasingly seek ways to shape bank lending policies. Local regulators want to see more lending in poor communities where banks don't necessarily see opportunity. Political activists want banks to adhere to their views of what is appropriate, like fighting global warming, commercial logging in rainforests, and terrorism in the Middle East. While many may agree that these are worthy goals, at what point do these broader objectives get in the way of banks' other obligation to shareholders, which is to make a profit? And how does this social engineering influence that other key role that banks play in a free market capitalist society, which is to allocate funds to those whose business ideas are deemed most worthy? The balance between a functioning financial system and social welfare is a delicate one. In our zeal to improve our society, we would do well to be mindful of that. For USA Inc., I'm Sarah Bartlett.